Hey everybody. In this video, we are going to continue talking about oil painting with a new method. We're going to be adding on to the painting that I did in my last video on alla prima techniques, and we're going to be doing what's called glazing. So, a little bit about that. Glazing, what is it? It's essentially applying transparent or translucent layers of paint over the top of a base. And why do we do that? Primarily because when we're working kind of transparently with our colors, we're allowed to sort of see through them into the layers below it. And that creates this really nice richness and depth that you may not receive if you're working solely with opaque colors. In this case, the technical term that we are focusing on is grisaille. So grisaille would be an underpainting that is done entirely in black and white, or it could also be brown and white. However, the purpose of grisaille is to build a tonal base for our values. So we're creating essentially just like a value study of what it is that we want to paint. Then when we do our glazing, all we're doing is focusing on the color, and we're not really thinking too much about the value of those hues, which really kind of helps us out because then we aren't having to make as many decisions. The values of the underpainting or the grisaille layer will shine through the colors that we put down. So to get started, we have our grisaille painting, and then I have just a handful of colors to work with. So I'm not overloading. This is kind of like a modified Zorn palette in that instead of black, I added ultramarine blue. So we have burnt sienna, we have yellow ochre, cadmium red, and white. This will allow me to get a really wide range of hue that is going to work well with skin tones. So to get started, we also need a medium to help us thin our paint. In this case, we're not using mineral spirits to thin the paint because as we're creating subsequent layers, we want to use less and less of those mineral spirits. That can cause cracking, it can cause yellowing, it can kind of just disrupt the paint a little bit. So what I'm going to be using in this is Galkyd. So Galkyd is an oil painting medium. It's going to thin our paint. As it says here, it's going to increase transparency and gloss, and it speeds drying. I like that because I'm, traditionally a watercolor painter, so I want my stuff to dry fast. Traditionally, we would use something like walnut oil or linseed oil to thin our paint. Just keep in mind that if we're using oils as our medium, it's going to take longer to dry. So that's something to keep in mind. What are your goals? Do you want to work faster or slower? So how much time do you want to blend? How much time do you want to do all this stuff? So those are some questions you want to ask yourself as you're working, depending on what kind of medium you wish to work with. So to get started, I'm just going to pour a little bit of this Galkyd into a container. Glass or metal will be your best bet to keep it safe. And I don't need a lot, so I'm just going to pour a little bit in here. Many artists have little metal tins that clip onto their palettes. I have them, but they are glued shut with medium, so unfortunately, I can't be using them right now. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of mix up some sort of pre-made hues with these colors so they're ready to go. So I think I've got a decent amount of values mixed up. So I think we should be able to get started just fine here. When it comes to glazing, there's a few different techniques you can do. One thing that I think is fun is to have kind of a variety of like really soft brushes. You can get like mops. Some people even use like almost makeup type brushes, like they're sort of shaped like you would for blush or foundation. Those work really nice. And what you end up doing is you'll loosely kind of paint your hues in place, and then you'll use those really soft brushes to kind of buff out the color and smooth it so that you don't see any brush strokes. That allows the value of the grisaille to sort of pop through. I don't have any of those brushes on me in my classroom, so I'm just using some softer synthetic brushes instead. So to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a little bit of this Galkyd and lay it down in my palette. We want to start kind of light with this. You don't want to overdo it, otherwise your stuff gets really soupy. And I'm going to start with sort of my lightest hues and kind of block some of those in. So I might do a little bit more mixing on my palette to get where I need as I mix it in with my Galkyd. The only downside to using these mediums like Galkyd and Liquin is they are pretty stinky. So, make sure that you are working in a well-ventilated area. And I'm going to brush this on. I'm not super worried about like brush marks or anything at this point because I am going to buff it out. So I'm going to lay this down and then slowly start introducing my darker hues. And we want this to be, a decent transparency as we're going. When I'm thinking about skin tones around the eye and those darker areas, we might have some more like bluish tones poking through. So I'm going to mix in some of that ultramarine to kind of cool down my hues. And for the purpose of speed with this video, I'm not going to be spending an enormous time on this painting. I'm going to be mostly kind of whipping it out in one go. If I were doing this for like a painting of mine in which I want to spend like a lot of time on it, I'd be doing multiple layers with my oils and like slowly getting more and more transparent as I'm building things up. I'd be letting each layer dry in between applications so that I can really like focus on building up my hues to be exactly how I want them to be. In this case, I'm working a little bit faster. I'm not as concerned about like being finished. I just want to show you the technique. So I'm almost kind of scrubbing in my paint at this point. I'm not working with a lot of paint on my brush because I don't want to overwhelm the painting with a first layer. I want to keep it nice and loose. And so I think I'll probably move to the buff out stage pretty shortly here. So just getting kind of like a little base layer in place here. All right, I think I'm going to stop here with my first layer and we'll do a little buff out. So we'll get to the fun part. You'll want a rag and one of those nice soft bristle brushes. I think I'll use a bigger one here. And basically I'm just going to kind of work in a little circular motion to kind of buff out those brush strokes and thin that paint out just a little bit more. You can use a rag to do this as well. That's obviously going to take off a lot more paint. And you can see too, as we're adding these layers, that you're going to lose a little bit of the fine detail in your grisaille. So eventually, as you build up your layers, you're going to want to eventually bring those details back after you've established your hues in place. So I will show you real quick with a rag kind of what that buff out looks like. So that's going to take off a bit more of your paint. It's going to be much more transparent as you go. So if you feel like you need to like really bring that grisaille layer back, you can take your rag and kind of buff out as needed. And obviously like the different types of brushes that you're using are going to take more or less paint off, buff more or less. So this is all kind of an experiment with what works best for you. At this stage, I'm going to just kind of continue adding in more layers, slowly building my values back up with my different different hues. If you're working with white, it's important to note that just white in general as a paint is going to be much more opaque than other hues. So, even glazing with white is going to have sort of an opacity to it automatically, and that's going to kind of cover up a number of your layers as you're working. So just something to kind of keep in mind. All right, so I've laid a little bit more down. I'm going to go ahead and sort of buff out again, just a little bit more of what I just put down. I'm frequently drying my brush off with my rag to kind of remove any of that excess paint so that I don't just smear everything around, especially when I'm switching to different areas of the painting. And I'm going to buff less in areas where I want it to kind of maintain some edges. And then I'm going to go in for round 3. I'm slowly kind of working darker and darker with my values and my hues just to kind of get things blocked in. I really like working with this glazing method using medium because I feel like even sometimes this starts to behave like watercolor, so I prefer it just because I can kind of create the same sort of subtle layers as I would with watercolor. Obviously, they're not going to do the exact same thing, but the transparency is really a lovely thing that I like to see when I'm working. It's fun to play with. And as I'm slowly kind of building up these layers right now, I'm noticing um, that Galkyd is starting to kind of set up a little bit. So my paint is getting sticky. Now, this can cause some problems as you continue to build up those layers because the stickiness might pull off some of the paint off of your canvas instead of putting it down. So usually that's a sign for you to kind of step back, take a little break, let it dry, and then you can begin working again over the top of it once it's dried. So I'm probably not going to work too much longer on this, just solely because I know it's going to start getting icky. I'm feeling like that kind of pinky flesh tone is just a little too bright, a little too intense. So I'm going to try and knock that down just a little bit. Although I like that color, it's not working with the rest of my hues. Just a little too intense. All right, so I'm at a stage here where I can't really add more without getting those sort of sticky brush marks that we don't want to see on our paintings. So at this point, I would need to dry for like a day or so, and then I could come back and continue adding layers. But I think just as a brief sort of description of what glazing is, I think this works out pretty well. So if you have more questions about glazing, by all means, shoot it in the comments. Thanks for watching and keep creating.